Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Learning Salon. We're very excited to have Anne Collins here today. As always, just a reminder, myself, I'm Aida Momen-Nejad, John Krakauer, and Melanie Mitchell host the Learning Salon, which is now again back to being weekly, to discuss contentions and bridges between artificial and biological learning. Every week we have a short talk, which is about 10 to 20 minutes, and then about 2 hours of a discussion. You can drop your questions in the chat area during the talk if you think there's something unclear, and we will try to address it. But the speaker wouldn't see those questions or be able to answer during your talk. If you want them to see a question after the talk and address it, please put them in the Ask a Question area underneath here, and also vote on each other's questions. Also, if you don't want to appear on screen, please say ask for me. Otherwise, we might ask you to come on screen and ask it on screen. Another thing is that disagreement is completely okay, especially in such an interdisciplinary environment, but we keep it respectful. So not disagreement for the sake of disagreement, but disagreement with the goal of understanding is totally fine. We understand each other. If we disagree, it's fine. The goal is to understand. There's a very interdisciplinary audience here. Some people are philosophers, computer scientists, linguists, psychologists, neuroscientists. And that means that it's totally okay if there are terms or words that you don't understand, or it means something else in your field. You can ask what it means in this other field, but I recommend not to theorize or tell others that their discipline is completely wrong about something, but to take a look at the different meanings of those disciplines. If you're a junior person or a student and you're usually afraid to ask questions, this is a good place to practice asking questions, because there's 2 hours time for asking questions, or 1.5 hours, however much Anne might have after her talk. So if you put your question in the Ask a Question area, if you wanted to appear online, that's also okay. Because there is a lot of questions, there's less stress in terms of the sort of threshold for raising your hand or asking a question. So we encourage junior folks to ask their questions too, but also senior folks. It doesn't mean it's just for students. Okay, with that, I'm just going to very briefly introduce Anne. It's a pleasure to have Anne here. I met Anne Collins, I think, probably more than 10 years ago or 12 years ago or something, when we met at SFN every now and then. And just discussed our trajectory. I think since Anne was in her postdoc and I was still in my grad school. And then over the years, we've kept in touch. We're in very adjacent fields, and we've constantly seen each other at conferences. Fun fact, I always seem to hold Anne's babies at conferences, and that's one of my favorite things about seeing her at conferences. Anne is a professor of psychology at University Berkeley, and she is, I should have said University of California, Berkeley. And then she is very well known in the field for a while now for her work on various aspects related to higher cognitive function, using reinforcement learning, behavioral experiments, neuroscience. And what kind of stuck with me the most is her use of working memory in explaining certain phenomena, and her particular critique of model-based reinforcement learning, the way that it's used in human reinforcement learning. So I'm very excited to hear from her. She's also done work on hierarchical reinforcement learning that she has brought it into the human domain. And something that I really liked also from your PhD work with Etienne Coquelin was the sort of the which very much resonates with me, is this kind of idea of hierarchy in the prefrontal cortex. So generally, big fan of Anne's work and her lab's work, and very excited to hear from her. And do you want to share your screen just to make sure it works?
Sure. Window. Is that working?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, so.
Yes, perfect. Take it away.
Awesome. Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much for the introduction too. It's also been a pleasure to bump into Aida over the years, and I'm happy to be here. So this is a bit of a a new talk for me, and I'm going to keep it fairly high level because Ida told me this was a very interdisciplinary audience. So I wanted to try to put together something that got us to think about how to bridge across different domains. And I noticed in Ida's introduction, it was more like biological learning and artificial learning. And I always like to put a third one, like to separate neuroscience and cognition. And I think my talk should let you know a little bit why that is. So I'll keep it high level, not too much data, more broader ideas. So I'm very interested in human learning, and in particular in something that's a bit the frontier, which is trying to understand how humans are able to learn so flexibly in ways that artificial agents haven't managed to mimic yet. So humans are very flexible. We keep adapting to new situations. For example, we all have had the experience of getting a new device, like a new phone or a new computer, and having to adapt to them. And we're very efficient at that. We don't learn from scratch. We can reuse lots of our past knowledge. We also learn new, more physical tasks, like how to change a diaper on a wriggling baby, or how to use new software, like we all had to do at the beginning of the pandemic, and other everyday behaviors that can quickly become new habits too. So we are very flexible learners, and what I try to understand in my research with my lab is I try to characterize this learning, but this flexibility, but I also try to understand what the computations are really that support humans' uniquely efficient and flexible learning. And so that's what I like to talk about today in my talk. And I'd like to not give an answer to that, but rather to reflect about how we can go about trying to understand those questions and what different ways of trying to understand this are. So I take an approach very much based on reinforcement learning. And I think one of the first important things is to be careful about words. So reinforcement learning means different things in different fields. So if you take the field of applied math or artificial intelligence, there's a very clear definition of what reinforcement learning is. This is a schematic that probably everyone has seen from Asen and Barto. Essentially, there's a clear definition of a class of problems and algorithms where there's an agent, an environment, states, actions, and rewards, transition functions, reward functions, and reinforcement learning algorithms are this family of algorithms that help us solve a very specific optimization problem within those problems. So reinforcement learning algorithms, there's a lot of them. The maybe simplest one of them is this kind of update. Ida, is my mouse visible? Can I use it as a pointer?
Can you move it around?
Here? No, no, let me see. It looks like there's a...
I don't see it. I see that oh, now I see it.
Okay, great. Okay, I figured it out. Sorry about that. Okay, so this is maybe the simplest possible equation that is reinforcement learning, like the delta rule. You have a reward prediction error here. That's the difference between a reward and an estimate of the value of an option, that a learning rate that multiplies that and updates the value over time. And of course, there's the whole range from this super simple equation to way more complex things here. This is terribly outdated now, but it's the DQN from 2015. So we have super simple one-line kind of error algorithms, and we have much more complex ones like deep reinforcement learning. And a whole family in between. So this is what people in AI think of probably when they talk about reinforcement learning. Now, if you talk to a psychologist or a cognitive scientist, reinforcement learning is going to have a slightly different meaning. Reinforcement learning, we'll think about it really as the type of learning we do that is dependent on uh, valenced outcomes, so appetitive or aversive outcomes. So people might know this XKCD frame where you pull a lever, you get zapped. And with a normal reinforcement learning process, you'd be like, I guess I shouldn't do that. Obviously, if you're a scientist, you might want to repeat the experiment. Okay, so this is aversive learning, for example, and we might think of it as part of the behavior of reinforcement learning. Or on the flip side, it's the type of learning that you do where you tend to repeat choices that led to something very rewarding, like this baby is clearly enjoying chocolate and repeating what he's done. Okay, so this is a slightly different meaning for reinforcement learning in the cognition area. In neuroscience, there's, I think, again, a fairly different meaning. There's been lots of seminal work by Ray Montague, Peter Dine, Wolfram Schultz, and many others since that's shown that there's a network in the brain, in particular, dopaminergic signaling that seems to encode something like reward prediction errors from reinforcement learning algorithms. So a signal that signals unexpected predictions of reward, like here, and that signals unexpected absence of reward in a way that seems to map a reward prediction error. So it's of course always under debate, but at least fairly well accepted that dopamine codes something like a reward prediction error. And going further, people have done lots of work and shown that a specific network that goes from cortex to the basal ganglia and back to cortex encodes something that is very similar to reinforcement learning algorithms in a way that is causally related to behavior. Okay, so we can think of in neuroscience as this network as being a reinforcement learning network. Okay, so we have a term, reinforcement learning, that is used by people in the computational field, in the cognitive or psychological field, and in the neuroscience field. And obviously, there's links between all this. So obviously, there is some ways in which the reinforcement learning network in the brain supports cognition and behavior. And there is link between the computation in cognition and neuroscience, in particular in the sense that algorithms that we get from AI can explain some aspects of cognition and can explain some aspects of neuroscience. However, there's also lots of non-overlap. So this is a very busy slide. I don't want to go into the details, but the point is to see that the Venn diagram here between RL in psychology, neuroscience, and machine learning, it doesn't fully overlap. There's lots of aspects of learning in psychology, for example, that is neither well explained by reinforcement learning algorithms nor supported by the brain's RL network, for example. So how do we go about understanding flexible human learning? Well, the first thing we do is be precise about vocabulary like this. And the second thing we can do is try to deconstruct cognition. So try to take behavior and try to understand what modules or what subcomputations contribute to this behavior. So a fairly popular approach in recent years has been to go from computation to cognition, to take what we know from the domain of reinforcement learning in AI and say, like, can we take this and bring it as a tool to explain cognition? So I'll give an example of this. For example, if you take Sutton and Bartow, or any other reinforcement learning textbook, but really Sutton and Bartow, you'll quickly see that there's subcategories of reinforcement learning algorithms. So you could, divide them into offline versus online algorithms. You could subdivide them into model-based versus model-free algorithms, and within model-free, value-based and policy-based. And there's plenty more that you could put into this tree. Okay, but you can take this and then say, well, if there's these methods, maybe I can see if that could help me understand learning in humans, right? So you can go from the computation and say, let's bring this to cognition and see if that helps. So I'm taking this example because it's very famous and successful in the past 10 years. I guess 2011 is the first paper, so more now. But if you take this approach, then what you want to do is to design an experiment where model-based and model-free methods will give you different behaviors. And again, I'm not going to go into the details of this task. Many of you probably know it. If you don't know it, it doesn't matter much. The main point is that this experiment that we can give to humans or to computers is going to behave differently with those two lead to different behaviors if you use those two different types of algorithms. And sorry, here it's not matching in the right direction, but you see this crossover pattern here if the algorithm is model-based, and you see this non-crossover pattern here if the algorithm is model-free instead. So you take inspiration from AI, you design an experiment that behaves differently based on those two algorithms, and then you go look into humans and see how they behave. And for example, you might find something like this, where you see children have one pattern, and adults instead have something that looks like a mixture of the two patterns, and then say like, okay, it looks like adults have a mix of model-based and model-free methods, and this might be two relevant types of computations to explain cognition. Okay, and then the next step you can do is go back to cognition and say, okay, I've identified two types of cognitions, and I think this maps onto two traditional concepts of psychology, for example, in this case, planning and habits. And then you might go on and try to check whether that's the case or not. Okay, so I'm not going into any details here. I'm just trying to map out a way to try to understand how humans learn quickly. So I think there's lots of pitfalls to this approach. It's very productive, obviously. We've seen lots of very good research done with this in the past 10 years, including by AIDA with a successor representation and many other similar ideas. But I think there's important pitfalls to keep in mind. For example, with this specific example, you have a good match, for example, between the pattern that the algorithms and the behavior give you, but you don't have strong evidence that this pattern is unique, that only this algorithm could give you this pattern. Indeed, in this specific case, there's been lots of evidence that other algorithms could give you the same pattern, and so we're not that sure that there's a good match. It's also not clear whether the computations you identify that capture the patterns are actually cognitively meaningful. So like I said, we can try to map it to something that psychologists have identified as meaningful, like habits or planning. And it's not clear that the algorithms map on well to that. Right, so that was my last point. And so if you want more details on that, I've written a paper with Jeff Coburn trying to show why I think that while this kind of approaches have been very productive, they also have limitations that we should keep carefully in mind. So what I would like to do in the last part of my talk is propose a different approach to try to understand the computations that support dynamic, flexible, efficient decision making in humans. So for example, the idea here is instead of starting from computation to actually start from cognition and neuroscience and try to go from there into computation. So try to inform computation from what we see in cognition and neuroscience. So I'm going to give you an example too. And I'll spend a little bit more time on this. So imagine you're making a choice between an apple and a banana. And you pick the apple and you get, it's yummy, so you get reinforced. This can certainly be described with this very simple algorithm that I was telling you about earlier. Reinforcement learning or value-based decision making. So for example, if this child is making this choice between two items, she might have experienced lots of good apples and maybe only one bad, and experienced more bad bananas. And the point of reinforcement learning or value-based decision making is that it integrates all those past outcomes into a single cached value that allows us to make a quick decision. So like, I like apples better than bananas in general. Okay. However, we know from lots of psychological research that there's also many other ways in which we could be making this decision. So, for example, um, um, we could use short-term memory, for example. So this child might have been told immediately that today the apples are good and the bananas aren't good. And so they might be holding this information in mind and using it to decide on the apple. The child might also be doing some form of reasoning. For example, knowing that apples are good when you shop in store A, but bananas are good when you shop in store B. And maybe today we shopped in store A, so we should pick the apple. The child might also remember a very specific past event last year when they ate an apple and it was super yummy, and use that to guide their decision making. Okay, so the point is that even super simple decisions like this might come from many different cognitive processes. That's point one. But point two is that there's been lots of psychological work done identifying what those meaningful psychological processes are. And so maybe we should take inspiration of the psychological knowledge to guide us into identifying relevant computations. Okay, so I'll give just the example. I'll give a specific example, but the idea here is that we know a lot about cognitive processes and the neural mechanisms that support them. And we might know, for example, that there is a reinforcement learning a neural mechanism that supports reinforcement learning, but that there is also other neural mechanisms that support other cognitive processes that also support learning. And so we might use that to identify what the computations are that support learning. So the example I'll show from my research is how we use both working memory and reinforcement learning, even for the simplest type of learning. Okay, so let's think about that. We know that there is this reinforcement learning circuit in the brain, but also a separable working memory process in the brain. And they operate on something of a trade-off. So for example, the RL process seems to be incremental. It integrates a value or a policy, and it's not very flexible. By contrast, you can store information very quickly and in a detailed way in a working memory and very flexibly. With the downside that it has very low capacity, short durability, and is effortful compared to reinforcement learning. So we developed an experiment to, Aida, am I still fine in time?
Yes, you can take, if you need a couple of minutes to wrap up, absolutely.
Okay, great. So I'll wrap up this experiment and conclude. Okay, so we developed an experiment where participants see a stimulus.
No rush, by the way. Take your time, no rush.
Sounds good, thank you. Where participants see a stimulus on the screen and make a choice between three keys, three actions to select. So for example, here, press the index finger and then get rewarded or not rewarded. In this case, picking the index finger for the pumpkin was the right thing to do. And then they have another stimulus for which they need to make a choice again. For example, for the green beans, the middle finger might be the one that's correct. In this experiment, reward is deterministic, and doesn't change. So if you pick the index finger for the pumpkin and you get correct, it's always going to be correct in this block. There's not going to be any probabilities or changes. So if you have perfect memory, once you've selected the index finger once, you should always know to select the index finger. Okay, so that's going to be in one block. In other blocks, you'll get completely new stimuli. And the key thing we do is just manipulate how many things you're learning. So in second block, for example, you might learn about 6 different stimulus action association. And in other blocks, between 3, anywhere between 2 and 6 blocks. Okay, so the idea here is that this is going to be reinforcement learning behavior. You're getting rewarded for your choices, and you need to repeat the choices that are rewarded. And so it should capture the reinforcement learning aspect of the computations that support human learning by seeing how the reward history influences our behavior. But it should also let us know if we use working memory, because we're varying the load. And we know that working memory is sensitive to load. And we're also varying the interval. So how many trials back you saw the pumpkin with the correct outcome, which varies how long you need to maintain something in mind to reuse it. So when we do that, and if you simulate any type of reinforcement learning on this task, and plot the correct behavior as a function of how many times you've encountered a given stimulus here, the RL models say that it doesn't matter how many items you're learning, because the only thing that matters is how many times you've encountered each one, what their reward history is, right? So there's no effect of the set size here, all the curves overlap. When you take human participants instead, you get a very different picture where there's a massive effect of set size. You see, for example, for 2 stimuli, you'll get to asymptote by the 3rd iteration, which is logical because there's 3 key presses. So you try 1, you try 2, you try the 3rd one, and you should know which one is correct. And then if you have perfect memory, you can stick to that. But for all other set sizes, learning gets more and more incremental. Okay, and this is something that RL on its own can't capture, even with if you try various kinds of modifications. So what we need to do instead is capture this behavior with reinforcement learning, but also with a mixture in the policy of this reinforcement learning with working memory, where we put into the working memory computations, specifically the assumptions that working memory that come from psychology, that working memory is capacity limited or resource limited, it's forgetful, but it's very fast at storing information. And when you do that, you can reproduce the participants' behavior. Okay, so the approach here was to go from what we know in psychology and cognition and neuroscience, that there is a separable neural mechanism for working memory and that it should contribute to decision making, and identify that, and then try to understand what computations it supports and how that explains behavior. So in conclusion, I'd like the key points that I'd like to you to take away from this talk is that it's really important to remember that reinforcement learning means different things in different subfields, and that bridging those subfields really requires us to be precise about terminology. And I'll give an example here. Like if you see an impairment in the behavior of reinforcement learning, or in reinforcement learning parameters fit to the behavior, we should be very careful to not unduly conclude that this translates to an impairment to the brain's reinforcement learning network, for example. Human reinforcement learning, the behavior, is the result of multiple neurocognitive processes that can be studied separately. So I've given the example of reinforcement learning and working memory, but other people have also worked on episodic memory, for example, and I'm certainly not claiming it stops there. And only one of those processes relates to the brain's neural network. Um, Certainly not all of those processes can be reflected in reinforcement learning computations. And the fact that those processes are separate does not mean they're independent. There's lots of evidence that they actually interact, but they can also be separated. And I think this is relevant. This process going from cognition to computation could have interesting impact for people also studying AI, to take inspiration into how it is that humans manage to learn so flexibly. So thank you for your attention. And I'd like to thank my lab members and people in particular who contribute to what I talked about today. So Michael, Frank, Maria, Eckstein, and Jeff Coburn. And thank you. And I'll stop sharing if I can. Stop sharing. Oh, okay. Great.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Anne. I will leave the questions first to Melanie and John, because last week I think we had Melanie last. I think this time Melanie will be first, and then John, and I will be last since I know your work the most, I guess.
Great. Thank you. This was really a really good talk. I had a couple of questions. So you asked first, how do we tell if the modules we're talking about are cognitively meaningful in RL? And how, I guess my question is, how in general can we test this? You said that these human reinforcement learning is a combination of lots of different psychological aspects, including working memory and so on. But what's the right way to test it? I mean, is it just matching these kind of these decision experiments that ones you did, or something more unique?
That's a great question, and I'm not going to have a great answer to it. But I think what we can do is essentially respect a bit the expertise of 100 years of psychology. I think people have isolated components of behavior, things like working memory or semantic memory or episodic memory, and it's not perfect by any means, but it has it does have this separableness to it. I don't know what a better term is, because it's definitely not independent, like the things interact together, but in that sense it's not separable. It's not modules, because they certainly are interleaved to a degree, but I think it has identified some processes that are cognitively meaningful. And I think we're at a point in cognitive science where there's certainly still more work to do studying those processes individually, but also especially in the field of decision making, I think, of seeing how they come together to make decision making. So it wasn't a good answer, but it's the best I have. I guess the second best I have maybe is also to do cross-species studies, because I think it's kind of interesting, right? Because I study the kind of behaviors that are in many ways uniquely human. And people often tell me, well, what can you learn from collaborating with mice researcher or something like that? And I think I can learn a lot, because I think the subcomponents are there. And actually what we can do with mice research, for example, is I identify some things that are somewhat separable, like modules that can operate on their own, even if they still interact with others. So I think something that's meaningful psychologically also should be implemented in the brain in a somewhat, again, not independent but separable way.
So in the last experiment you showed, you didn't really talk about the models you were using. So were you using, what was the working memory, and what was the split between working memory and reinforcement learning?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't put any questions there since it was such a short talk. So the RL side was the simplest, delta rule kind of learning. The working memory side is a simplified version of what you might think of as working memory. So it's a module that stores information perfectly for the last trial, but then has a decay at each trial. So the information will be perfectly available at trial T+1, but then will decay at each trial. And the way we implement capacity limitation is through the mixture. So by saying that by doing the kind of naive approximation of saying, well, maybe you have just 3 slots available. And so if there's 6 items, the mixture is going to be a 3 out of 6, a weighting factor of 3 out of 6 times the parameter that scales the amount of working memory in the first place. So it's very simple, really. It's saying like, okay, I have perfect memory of the last association, decays over time, and it's mixed in proportion to the number of items that can be in working memory, which is parameterized. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but so if so that's a model-free reinforcement learning method that you were using.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
The simplest kind of, learning. So I just wonder, could something like model-based reinforcement learning kind of play the role of this mixture of working memory and model-free, if you had the right kind of models?
So I think this is orthogonal, essentially. So in this task, there's no, this is a bandit task, right? Contextual bandit task, right? So there's no, the choice you make does not control your next state. So there's no, a model-based algorithm is going to do this, behave exactly the same as a model-free RL algorithm on this task, and both of them are going to not show any set size effect. So in that sense, I said it was model-free, but it could be model-based. It's the RL component. So in that sense, it's orthogonal. The way in which it looks like model-based is that we think that model-based is more clever in a sense and relies more on explicit kind of processes. And so in that sense, that's what it looks like. But I don't think I want to do that mapping.
Okay, so I guess my last question is sort of, what is this distinction between model-free and model-based reinforcement learning useful in thinking about reinforcement learning in the psychology sense or the neural sense, as opposed to the computational sense?
It has been useful in terms of, I think it's generated a lot of very interesting data in science and results. I think it's, but I don't think it's a good mapping to what's happening in the brain. So I think that model-free RL is reasonably a good mapping to what's happening in the brain, but I think that model-based RL is too many things, essentially. It's too many subcomponents that I think is is not helping us right now parse out what computations are being done in the brain to support more complex types of decision making. And I think it's so I do think all this work has been useful, but I do think there's also it's also been hurtful in some ways, in that I think it's been oversimplifying questions. I think lots of people have been like really equating mall-free, mall-based to goal-directed planning and habits, and I think that's I think most people would agree at this point that that's really, really too simple and leading to wrong conclusions in more applied fields that are taking this to clinical populations or etc. And not teaching us that much in the end about what's happening in the brain. Yeah.
Okay, great. I'll hand it over to John.
Thanks, Anne. I really appreciate your talk because it really managed to capture what, I suppose at best confuses me about RL frameworks and at worst irritates me. And, I find it kind of interesting that, I really liked your sort of point that don't start from the computation, but go to the neuroscience into the psychology, in a sense, the cognition. And because there does seem to be a hypnotizing appeal of the computational version of RL, right? To the detriment, I think, of a more pluralistic way to think about cognition. So a number of things. One, I found kind of interesting that you showed the kid deciding between the banana and the apple, and it seemed like you had a working memory version, you had an episodic memory version, you had a reasoning version, and then you had an RL version, right? Those are the 4 boxes, right?
With no claim at all that those are the 4 boxes, right?
No, of course not.
Yeah.
No, of course not. But right away, but yet it seemed as though in your conclusions that you were willing to call all 4 choices of the apple over the banana RL, even though only one of the boxes was actually computational RL. Am I right? So, because but why do you call all 4 RL at all, right? and then you also use the word decision making. Yeah. Now, I agree that the decision to pick the apple over the banana, there are 4 ways, if I understand you correctly, that you could decide to pick the apple over the banana: episodic memory, working memory, computation, and reasoning, right? So does that mean that we should understand that non-computational RL is just entirely synonymous with decision making?
No. So first,
so is the girl making a decision to take the apple or the banana, or is she doing RL?
She's making a decision, yeah. So the point of this slide was not to illustrate RL, actually. It was more to illustrate decision making, and more to the point, the fact that even very simple decisions, something that seems like the simplest type of decision you could make, like a 2 alternative force choice, might be the product of a lot of different processes in the brain.
Why call all of them RL?
No, I don't call all of them RL.
On the conclusion slide, you said RL is due to many things.
That's true.
Not just RL computation. So was that a typo, or should you have said decision making?
Yeah, I should have said decision making. I think the same is true of RL, but I think more specifically decision making in this case. So the thing is, reinforcement learning includes two steps, right? In a sense, like you have to understand how people value different choices, and then you have to understand how they make a decision, right? Or I guess, you know, there's the whole not necessarily, I guess there's purely policy-based techniques, but you can, you know, you can imagine there's a part of about like getting the information, and then there's a part about making the decision based on the information. So this point was about decision making, but I think applies to RL too. So I think that's why I was trying to get at. When you're doing reinforcement learning, you'll have to do decision making, and decision making.
So if I see. So if I understand, to the degree that your decision about the apple over the banana is related in some way to your valuing the apple over the banana for different reasons, what you remembered in the short term, what you remembered in the long term, what you remember about the two types of stores. So in other words, decision making about something that regards value, it can be written in shorthand as RL in the general sense. Is that what you're saying? Okay, fine. All right. So
of something you've experienced, essentially,
right.
like value.
So in other words, you know, what causes me some confusion / irritation is, you know, the flexibility of the computational framework, you know, sort of maximization of future reward, you know, and then the more ecumenical view that you have, which is there are many cognitive processes that could contribute to RL in the more general sense that go beyond the more specific, in this sense, in this case, model-free computation. But that's really quite different to, for example, a paper by Silver and Sutton and others, where they'll say that reward is enough, where they will kind of explicitly claim that if you maximize reward with respect to a goal, some of those cognitive processes that you kept separate, let's take reasoning or working memory, if I understand them, they feel like within the computational version of the framework, that somehow these abilities that you separated out will just implicitly, which they explicitly say, it will implicitly pop up along the way because they're needed for maximization of reward. So am I to understand then that view, where all these other cognitive processes that you so nicely delineated are alternatives, is a different view from their more totalizing view, that those things will just pop up implicitly as a function of the computational version of RL?
Yeah, no, I don't think they'll just pop up, and I actually think that those other processes don't optimize the same, you know, objective. You know, I think that's the point I was trying to make at the end, that I haven't proven or anything, right? I haven't given you data or anything for, but that the working memory process, for example, is not optimizing, you know, the sum of expected future discounted reward, and I never get that in the right order, but
I get it. I mean, I of course I'm far more sympathetic to the more ecumenical, and I understand it gets a bit confusing to use all the different ways you can make a decision about value comes under the general rubric of RL, not the specific computational algorithmic version of it. And then there's these totalizing views where the RL algorithmic universe could get everything done, which I don't buy.
But no, I think it's important. I still think it's relevant, right? Because I think if you take most RL out there, RL experiments from my kind of community, like psychology, cognitive science, and you know, what people do, like they do experiments, they like people see things on the screen and you get points or rewards or whatnot, and you make choices, and then you fit an RL model to it, whatever simple or more advanced version. And if you look at it, if you look carefully at those papers and look, for example, at the learning rates that you get fit on the behavior, it's not rare that you get learning rates between 0.5 and 1, for example. And if you think about it, a learning rate of 0.5, like your learning rate of 1 is not RL, right? It's just like, let's remember the last thing I saw and do that, right? And, if you're between 0.5 and 1, it's, not quite that, but like maybe the last 2 or 3. And in my mind, that's much more likely to capture something like explicit memories, like, oh yeah, like I saw this a rocket and then this alien and I got reward. I'm remembering this explicitly and reusing it, rather than
Right.
something that is actually RL, right?
Right.
And so in that sense, I think people do use the term reinforcement learning for studying this kind of behaviors, that I think is not RL in the brain, and it's not really RL computationally either, I think, despite the fact that RL algorithms capture this behavior well. The thing is, RL algorithms are so flexible, I think, that we capture a lot with them, even if it's not really
I mean, it's a very deep point you're making, and it's happened actually in the motor learning literature as well, where exactly what you just described happens, where where a state space model can fit quite well a series of very qualitatively distinct processes, but they're all quite well fit by that model, right? Now, I've been a big critic of that approach. I've said that actually obscures, because you never know whether your fit is just it doesn't explain all the variants just for other reasons, or whether in fact what you've done is you fit a suboptimal model that's quantitatively not fitting super well, because qualitatively, as you just said, something entirely different is happening, but the fit is good enough. Now, I find that whole thing very confusing. And, it's interesting that I've never really been a fan of the door-like sequential task, because I find it really interesting that for me as an experimentalist, what I would like to show before you do the experiment is true model-free behavior and true model-based behavior. In other words, that they really exist under this kind of task, so that when you do the experiment as you showed, and you said it's a mixture, right? Well, it might be something entirely different, right? In other words, this happened in sort of Bayesian integration experiments, where the best way to do those is you show what happens under noise under the two sensory modalities alone, and then you can empirically see whether you get a Bayesian integration, rather than just putting the two modalities to begin with together and then show that you can decompose into two. Sure, but that's not as strong as an experimental result. But that's a quibble I've had for ages with that kind of task. But I don't want to go there right now. I mean, I also have one last question, which is, it's really interesting. I read your article, and I thought it was really, insightful. The one about, the not dichotomizing. But I find it really interesting, because you said that even more so than my criticisms and what you've been saying about the model free versus all the other processes. But my understanding has been that the real royal road to cognition, has really been about model-based RL, right? That you have models of the world, and somehow you operate on these models of the world. And that's the move towards offline thinking, modeling, representing, cognitizing, you name it. And it's interesting that you made this point, which I think could have been missed, is you said, let's not confuse model-based behavior with model-based RL. Right? So I just wanted to sort of, and I agree with that, right? I mean, I think that, going back to Kenneth Craik in the 1930s, who really, like many people, always thought that cognition was something about having abstract, flexible models of the world that you can operate on instead of stimuli. So can I just ask the last question is, I personally don't buy the model-based RL as cognition pretty much at all, but I do believe that model-based behavior is important for cognition. So can you help me understand, and I mean this non-polemically, I'm being absolutely, is there a way for me to feel less uncomfortable about the gap between model-based RL and model-based behavior in our search for cognition? Because I find myself frustrated by it, right? Because if you look in neuroscience, you've got model-based navigation and you've got model-based decision-making. And those are the two biggest areas of the belief that if you begin to crack model-based decision-making and model-based navigation in mice, you're on your way to cognition, maybe even human. And I struggle. I just don't buy it. And I was just wondering, if you could just say more. I know this is a long-winded question. I'm famous for them. But what is the nature of the gap between model-based RL and model-based behavior and cognition?
I mean, I'm not sure. I'm sorry. It's hard. I can't defend model-based RL myself, right? Like I've been criticizing it more than defending it in the past. So you're putting me in a weird spot here. The comment I was trying to make, I think, in the paper that you're referring to is that that there's many ways to use a model of the environment or of the world in RL that is not for planning, even if you're doing RL. And the example I would give in the context of the two-step task is that if you have a predictive, transition model of the environment where you're predicting where you're going to land after you make your first choice. You can use that for forward planning, but you can also use that for backward inference, right? And you can say like, oh, I landed here, which occurs more often when I make the other choice. So I can reactivate internally that other choice and do more free reinforcement on this internally reactivated state rather than the actual true state in which I was, which will give you exactly the model-based pattern, but not in a planning way, rather in an inference way, right? And so to me, in that sense, that's just an illustration of how you can have an internal model of the environment that you can put to good use with still more free computations of RL to have behavior that looks more sophisticated than simple, more free reinforcement learning.
But the interesting point there, right, Aaron, is that it looks more sophisticated, but as Ida and others have done, you don't have to invoke planning with the model for that.
You don't have to invoke planning at all. Yeah. And the reason I think it's important to think that is that we have a whole circuitry in the brain that does more free learning. And I think if we think about it carefully, actually, that circuitry is likely to have been, hijacked from its original, like simple, just like learn simple, like action reward associations to enabling us to do much more complex looking behavior, even without very different algorithms.
And I guess the successor representation is a wonderful
example of that. But other hierarchical reinforcement learning, I think, is also like we will fall out also in that class. And I think that gets us back to the let's look at what we know already. And we know the brain has those RL more free RL circuits that can be applied to many different types of inputs, and that is likely to support a bunch of more complex behavior than what we think of as the simplest RL. Yeah.
Do you think it's so interesting? I'm like, so would you think it would be fair to say that it could be that if we were all doing the learning salon in 5 years or 10 years, and this is very provocative, but why not? Do you think it's possible that we will have other explanations outside of an RL framework for what we consider model-based behavior and cognition, and that the sophisticated behaviors that look model-based in the planning sense will end up just being sophisticated Model 3 upgrades. And that in fact, outside of machines, model-based RL doesn't really exist in the planning sense in animals.
I don't know. I do think that humans do planning in a sense. So I do think that,
absolutely.
right. So
they're doing model-based, RL-based planning.
Yeah,
right?
and I don't know. I think it's possible. I think both are possible.
But it's not crazy to invoke at this current juncture the possibility that a lot of sophisticated behavior that at first blush might look model-based planning could actually be something else, as you described, and that planning in humans might be something that is really quite distinct from the RL version of model-based planning. And right now we don't have fantastic evidence, but we don't have fantastic evidence in an animal or a human that they're doing RL-based planning, right? Even though
Wait, John, let's not get too excited about that.
I'm just asking. I mean, I know your position. Well, I don't maybe, but I'm just saying. But at the moment, it sounds to me, Anne, that the jury is still out. Would that be fair to say?
I think that's fair to say. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
No
more
I wanted
questions.
To say.
All right.
I'm surprised. I'm sure you're going to have more questions later. But what I wanted to say, a number of people seem to be asking about the different definitions that we are using here. So maybe I'll give it a shot, and then maybe Anne, just so that there's different perspectives on this. And I will temporarily mute you just because my mic is terrible. I want to reduce the feedback. If my voice gets too bad, raise a hand or something, because my mic is not working well today. So what John is describing at model-based behavior, so when did it start for people to talk about model-based, model-free in humans or computers? It started in computer science. It was not meant to explain human behavior first. What happened was Nathaniel Daw, when he was doing his doctorate work, basically, he started to apply these different definitions in terms of human decision-making. So that is a time where some of these algorithms that existed for a decade or more than a decade, these algorithms started to get imported into explaining human decision-making. So if an agent does something the same as a task that I'm doing, which agent is going to show similar behavior to humans? So what did Model Free do? Model Free just says, if you have a number of decisions, just says, on average, when I take the right action, I get this much reward, and when I took the left action, then I took that much reward, and the right action was higher, therefore that's the better one. What it does is that it stores a table. The table says action, reward, action, reward, action, reward, or state action, reward, state action, reward. What that table doesn't have, and I'm exaggerating because it should be actually value. It's kind of like the average discounted reward over time, but I'm just like trying to simplify what I'm trying to say. So you have a lookup table in Model Free. You do not have a model of the world that you unroll or that you combine in order to decide whether you're going to choose left or right. You're not consulting an internal map of the environment when you're deciding, when you're in Model Free behavior, whether you want to go left or right. What does that mean? It means if I change something small in the model of the environment, in the actual environment, if I change something small, Model Free cannot adapt immediately. It needs to go back from the beginning and re-experience all of those actions and rewards to understand what's the new consequences, what changes in the table. That means Model Free, without direct experience in the world, cannot update its table of state action and values, the value of things to do in the world, because it doesn't have an internal model of the world to consult it. That makes specific predictions for specific behavior that people would show. Then what is model-based? Now, let's say you had a model of the world that you could consult. So if I change some things partially in the world and you saw something that has changed in the world, can you update your whole idea of what is the valuable thing to do in a particular state? And that process of consulting an internal model of the world and unrolling it one step at a time, this is usually considered, some people call it the T matrix, some people call it the transition matrix. This is a matrix of, or tuples. You can imagine it as a matrix of tuples, which you say, given I started in state 1, let's say that's my door, and I took action right, say I just turn right, I'm going to end up in state 2. Let's say that's my friend's door. And if I go left, then I end up at the ice cream shop. So state 3 is ice cream shop, state 2 is my friend's home, state 1 is my door. And then the value of each of them would be different at different times. Let's say I'm lactose intolerant, then obviously right is the place that I want to go. So now let's say that somebody says, oh, you know, the ice cream shop was replaced with, I don't know, something that has a lot of value for me. Then maybe this value will change. The point is, in order to understand this whole distinction between behaviors of these two cases, you need an experiment that has at least 2 steps, not just 1 step. When it's 1 step and it's left or right, model free works fine. But when you have more than 1 step, then that's the time where when you want to update things, something changes in the 6th step or in the 5th step in order to propagate it back to the decision you make next time from state 1. You need to consult your model of the world, because otherwise you will need to directly experience all of it. What do I mean by this? Let's say I never got to come outside of my home, go left, and then go upstairs to find out that another friend of mine lives there. However, someone just told me, hey, so one of your friends moved upstairs. I have not integrated it. If I'm a model free agent, without experiencing it directly, I have not integrated this. So if a model free agent is not going to realize that the value of left is now higher because there is, I don't know, ice cream shop, but above is another friend of mine, whatever. Strange examples I'm giving just so that like it's clear what I'm trying to talk about. When you add this 2nd step, model free cannot figure this out without actually going left and going upstairs. And because of the fact that
so can I jump in? This is okay to jump in. So you know how when you do experiments in humans, you or like in psychology, you change the experiment, you try to just change one thing at a time, so that if something changes, like why it changed. I think one issue I have with your definitions is that between your model free and model based era, there's at least 2 steps. Like one is model based compared to model free has a model of the world. And 2, it uses that model in a very specific way for planning.
Yes,
you're with me so far, right? But that's 2 things, right? And I think
I was gonna get there after I explained this first.
Yeah, because I think it invalidates a bunch of the things you say, right? So I agree with you. I agree with you at first approximation, but I think we have to be careful there.
So, okay, I'm going to continue what I was saying just to make it clear what I was going to say. If we only stayed at that level, then it would seem like any planning behavior model-based would be able to capture human experiments or human behavior, or human decision-making. And that is the kind of situation where people started saying it's model-based behavior if you actually realize, without having to go in person upstairs to the left, that this is model-based behavior. This was not necessarily a claim about all of the, human cognition runs by model-based behavior, or that it's necessary there. It was just like, this would be a model-based behavior if you can do that. Does that mean no other RL algorithm can do that? No, actually, there are a lot of other RL algorithms that do it differently, and they can do that too. Those algorithms, you can see the difference between those algorithms and model-based algorithms in other cases. For instance, when you can look at my 2017 paper, when you move the rewards and when you move the transition structure, or when you have multiple steps. In one case, the behavior would be different. In another case, the representations and the process, in both cases, the representation and the process would be different. And the important thing there is that you can explain what was considered model-based behavior before with algorithms that are not model-based reinforcement learning algorithm. And that's where this distinction comes between model-based behavior, by which we mean a behavior that cannot be generated by model-free algorithm. Usually people, that's what they mean by that, at least in computation, in psychology. And then a range of algorithms can capture this thing that historically has been called model-based behavior, because it started with a two-step experiment that Nathaniel Dawes started in 2005. In his, 2013 was, I think, the most cited paper of it, but the idea was there from earlier. And then they suggested, oh, human behavior cannot be completely captured by just model-based or just model-free, so it's a mixture of the two. So for a long time, and still there are people who that is completely enough for them. That's what they do with RL. They use a mixture of model-based and model-free, and that's it. But then some of us came and said, oh no, wait a second. The representations in the brain don't look like these one-step transitions, like the stuff that model-based RL assumes. Secondly, there are certain behaviors humans show, for instance, in the experiments we have in reward and transition revaluation, that model-based algorithms, model-based agents, MBRL agents, cannot even show human-like behavior on them. Why? They were actually doing way better than humans in cases where humans had asymmetry. And that means they're using some other approach. They were not showing the asymmetry in different tasks that humans show. And the suggestion is that there could be that humans are using something different to display that same behavior. And if you don't take account of the differences in accuracy and the differences in reaction times, and you just draw a very big picture, you can say, it's just not model-based. It's just not model-free. And if model-based only meant not model-free, those theories would hold. But they don't hold, because behaviorally, we have evidence that humans don't behave like model-based agents. And second, neurally, we have evidence that representations don't look always always one step. The brain does use multi-step representations. So I hope that makes a distinction clear between model-based behavior, which is a certain kind of success in some conditions in a two-step experiment and some other experiments that has been performed. And people say something does show model-based behavior or not, they just mean you didn't show model-free behavior. And then there is model-based algorithms or agents. And those are the agents that, for instance, they have an algorithm, they run it in a certain way. And then there's some idea that the brain might be model-based, solving a problem in a model-based way. Then people try to map the specific ways that model-based solves a problem into the kinds of representations the brain makes. That has had a lot of challenges, and that's part of the reason other alternatives have been more desirable in neuroscience. So behaviorally, and in terms of neuroscience, we have good reason to think model-based doesn't capture human experience, human behavior. I hope this captures those distinctions. Sorry, go on.
I think it's a little, when you say model-based, I think you're implicitly putting reinforcement learning
MBRL,
at the end of that.
When I say MBRL, I mean MBRL, model-based reinforcement learning.
Because when John was saying model-based, he meant something entirely different.
That's not what we mean by model-based at all, John. I've had this issue with you before. That's not what I don't mean a general thing.
Ida, do you call your successor representation-based RL, do you call that model-free or model-based?
We explicitly have multiple papers saying it's somewhere between the two, because it uses caching the way that model-free uses, but it also uses separate representations and rewards the way that model-based does. So it's neither
exactly.
of those.
And so I think that's my point, right? It's like going beyond dichotomies. Is that like it's not a good? It's just not two things, right? It's like you have. Model-free is also two things, right? It has the model-free computations, like to produce cached values. You have to, like, for example, update with a route prediction error or something like that, right? Do Q-learning or active critic or whatnot. But, like you have computations that will lead you to cached values. But this could be applied to state representations that could be internal state representations that could be dependent on the model or not, right? So in that sense, it's orthogonal. You can have model-free computations that still rely on the model of the environment for the states. And then same for like, you could also use model-based computations on model-dependent things, and you could also use models for other things and still apply model-free computation. So it's really in that sense that I think it's really very artificial to just say one or the other, especially since there's at least 2 degrees of difference between them that could be recombined in multiple ways.
Historically, because of Nathaniel Dawes' work, things started to be model free and model based, and that makes sense. Like scientifically, people start with the smallest things. People were all the rage about just the model free, which had been successful since 1997 to explain dopamine. And what Nathaniel did is, hey guys, this is not the full story. There's also model based, and there's also the mixture of the two. And then we obviously come and say, hey, it's not just the two. There is a whole spectrum, and each of them has different meanings. And I came and say, okay, here is a number of spectra, a number of the algorithms on the spectrum that actually captures human behavior. So I think we're on the same page, but I think it's important for people to realize first what historically happened before they hear the nuance, because I think a lot of people confuse the notion of model-based with the notion of cognitive maps. They think whenever anybody says model-based, they mean that there is any kind of model in the brain, and therefore success representation is also model-based. They don't realize we're talking specifically about MBRL, as Melanie very correctly pointed out.
But I think it's fair, right? Because I think we should be able to talk about model-based things that are not specifically MBRL. You know, and I think there's like lots of learning and reinforcement learning that is model-based, that is not MBRL in the planning sense. And so I think it's unfair that this word is being hoarded, I guess, in a sense, in that way. And we should be careful about that terminology in a sense.
And I would say, that you do see slippage. You do see people.
John, can you come closer? Your voice is.
You do see slippage. In other words, I do. You could even hear people like Tim Behrens making a case that there is some subterranean link from thinking about model-based RL and model-based behavior in navigation. In other words, I feel like not everyone is as careful as Ida, and people do get away with too much. I mean, I don't think that, the door task, which is clever, really teaches us much about anything, quite frankly. And I think that it's basically, I really don't. I think it was, and I think that it's, like going up a tree to try and reach the moon.
John, that's 95% of neuroscience of decision making, rodent, human studies, all of it. You realize, like,
well, yeah, that doesn't make it fantastic.
I know,
right?
I know. I'm just saying. No, I totally agree with you. I think,
I think it's because they don't do. And I think it's because they don't do what you do. I mean, you have been consistent. I mean, I do believe that they at least implicitly rely on the fact that we do think cognition is in some way model-based in the broader sense, and that somehow model-based RL is front-of-the-line candidate for giving us insight into model-based behavior. And I would say, just to finish, and I do believe that planning is really the most important place to invoke model-based behavior in the broadest sense. But finding planning in the MBRL framework, actually, you find other behaviors in the non-planning sense that suggest model-based, like the door experiment. But planning is very, 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 very hard to find in animals or humans that has to be under the MBRL framework.
I actually think. Sorry,
1 second. Like, I just want to make one thing clear. John, do you think you can use another word for the idea of the broader notion of MBRL? So, the broader notion of model-based that you're talking about. Can you give it another word? And why do you need to use the word model-based for it?
No, I agree with you. I think that, yes, I think you're right that we shouldn't. In other words, you could accuse me equally well of blurring in the other direction. And maybe it's correct that for hygiene's sake, we should use MB for RL because of the ingenuity of that original door experiment and everything else that you've said. And we're just going to have to come up with some other word. It's just unfortunate, right? Because the notion of having models of the world in your head predate any kind of RL. So it seems a little unfair.
In fact,
RL to own it.
RL comes from the behaviorist tradition initially, and that was explicitly non-model based.
Anti-cognition, yeah.
Sorry, but just
I
to be
think
clear, for 40 years now, RL has included maps of the world, model-based, replay, etc. So it's not, while I am writing a paper about the behaviorist legacies of RL, I disagree with Melanie that the past 40 years can be thrown away entirely.
I just said where it came from initially. I was just noting an irony.
but you know, there is also work like by Mitsuo Kawado and others like this, like that predates also Nathaniel's task, that was called multiple model-based reinforcement learning, that use models of the environment not for planning but for inference, you know, and for inference of the current expert. For example, this is a model learning work actually that John probably knows about, but that where the goal of the model was not to plan, but was rather to say like, what's the latent state of the environment, and which expert should I use based on this latent state of the environment. And I guess, John, I'm curious what you think about this, because to me, I actually think that the role of models for decision making is maybe less planning for cognition and more inference, actually more like generalization, really, like saying like,
very interesting.
and that's why I'm pushing back on what Ida was saying earlier, also saying like model free can never adapt quickly. I think model free computations can make you adapt quickly if you use a model of environment as a way to identify states, essentially, internally, and
Wait,
so do
wait.
generalization.
Are you talking about the
just to
Dyno
say
model?
about the Kawato paper, yeah, I mean, it's actually really interesting. The parallels are unbelievable, Anne, right? So when the original Kawato-Wolpert paper was written about multiple forward inverse models, right?
Yeah.
At that time, it wasn't an inference notion. It was more, you know, can you run a forward model in the planning sense, right? And then sample, right?
Right.
But then what happened is it has advanced to a point where I actually think that Daniel has a paper in Ticks right now where it's much more about the inference version, right? And in fact, there's no good evidence in the modal learning literature that forward models are actually used for planning. In other words, the planning notion has fallen by the wayside. And wouldn't it be delicious if, just in the same way, to the degree that you're not model free completely, but you are model based for an inference internal state estimate, but you're not planning? I actually think that it would be deliciously parsimonious if those two fields ended up going in the same direction. So I'm very sympathetic to what you're saying, and planning in the sense that we really care about exists in another algorithmic universe.
So we could potentially get a couple of questions in, I think, if that's okay. And I think some people expressed interest to join online in order to ask questions. So I'm just gonna find first. I think Jason first said, and I think their question is one of the highest voted one, at least the last time I checked. I should check again. Please vote on each other's questions, everyone. Imran is another person. I'm gonna invite them. I don't know if they're still here, but I'm gonna invite them also. Takes a moment for them to usually join. Also sending that. Right, so I'm inviting them both. I think, John, regardless of all this conversation, I don't think it's unfair at all to say, just use another word. And to say there is no other word, cognition had this, it's bizarre to me, to be honest. Like you use the word ecumenical twice today. So I think you can manage to find another word, you know, for that. Just personal.
Well, I mean, I totally agree. Although you would say, why should RL get a term that existed before RL?
Wait, someone used the term model-based before the first model. No, wait. 1998 is the paper you suggested. The term model-based RL was invented before that. I'm sorry.
Yeah, but the notion of models of the world came in.
No, that's the notion. It's not the word. We're talking about the specific word. The specific word started in computer science. Why do you want to take it away from them?
But are we allowed to say models of the world?
Absolutely, 100%.
So what you're saying is don't say model-based. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying say it, but refer to the thing in the world that is the model-based thing, or say, hey, I am going to use it against the way that computer science uses it. I think that clarity is very much needed. You know, it's already
I agree. I mean, I think it's really important, because I think the notion of representations of the world upon which you operate, rather than the stimuli in the world, as Melanie well knows, is a very deep idea. And I think that we just have to be careful that it doesn't become coterminous and get hijacked with a much more restricted set of algorithms, which is model-based RL.
So I think the highest voted question was Imran's. So do you want to please go ahead?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, thanks for the great talk. And I was the one who asked about how you would define the term model for psychology and neuroscience, and if you think that's different from the definition of model in computational AI. And I mean, it's kind of, I guess, for the last like 10 or 20 minutes, you've already been kind of talking about how to define model, and I think I kind of, I mean, I think I agree that RL shouldn't be able to like hijack the term, shouldn't necessarily like have hijack the term model. So it still seems like it's not clear to me what you think the definition of model should be in psychology. So I'm just curious what you think of that.
I think it's broader, essentially. Like currently in model-based reinforcement learning, a model is essentially the model of it's the transition function and the reward function, right? I think in psychology, it's going to be something, any representation of the environment that's relevant. For example, in the paper we were just talking about, like the Kawado paper, this includes some kind of predictive model, like prediction that not just what the next state is, but what the probability of an outcome, of a specific type of outcome, is going to be. And some people might also include like something more complex than a transition function in terms of a map of the environment or something like that. So I think any internal representation of the environment that's relevant might come into the psychology and neuroscience definition of a model. Is that fair?
I agree. I just want to say, Imran, we were discussing the specific word model-based, not model itself. So totally feel free to ask a question about model.
You could argue maybe the most famous one
was
might be mental rotation, right? That somehow, those classic papers where you seem to be able to imagine moving this representation from one rotational orientation to another. It really suggests that you can somehow visualize this object and move it in your head in some kind of linear reaction time. And that's the word model. You have some sort of model in your head that you can rotate in order to do the mental rotation task. Now, I don't think that having an object in your head that you can mentally rotate, we are far, far away from transition matrices in reinforcement learning, right? So just so you can see how much bigger the world of models is. And the question is, I mean, I can see to eye out, we shouldn't say model-based when we're talking about that kind of thing. And it would be wrong to do that. But I would like to avoid the kind of reward is enough idea that somehow through a reinforcement learning framework, we're going to understand how we do mental rotation, right? That's where I get, now this is not a straw man. Obviously, Ida's not saying that. No one here is saying that, obviously. But sometimes one gets the idea that somehow, if your reward is to correctly rotate the object, and your goal is to rotate the object, then somehow, miraculously, the rotational model ability will fall out as a consequence of maximizing that kind of reward. And I just find that very uninformative.
Can I ask a follow-up question on these answers? I guess one thing I'm wondering is about Anne's answer, that any kind of representation that's relevant sounds a little broad to me, or like worryingly broad, in that, I mean, for one thing, aside from the fact that there's debate about what representations are, but also just the fact that it seems a little weird to make them totally coincide. I mean, in that case, it just seems like the term model might be superfluous, and we should just like use one term or the other term instead of using two different terms as if they refer to different concepts. So I guess that part just seems a little confusing to me, to make the definition so broad that any representation would count. And then about what John was saying, the mental rotation, I also didn't fully understand how that is so far away from the transition matrix idea, because it seems like when you rotate an object, you maybe are transitioning through the states of the object, and like maybe it's not a discrete transition matrix. Maybe the states are continuous, but it seems like there's some connection to the.
Yeah, I mean, we can
to
have
the transition idea.
That's exactly the kind of thing. I agree. That's the kind of thing I detest, right? And we can have that. I think that's like a false friend, quite frankly. And I worry when it's what we're doing here is not like a shared mechanism, but there's a kind of metaphor from the RL framework that allows you, like Anne said, to couch mental rotation in that language. But to me, it seems like a false friend.
Wait, who's the false friend again? I think I lost a bit of
that you could frame mental rotation in that way. But to me, what happens there is you're getting much closer to metaphor and analogy than a genuine shared model.
Okay, I don't know where mental imagery came in, or mental rotation, so I'm going to put it there. But I just wanted to say to Imran, so the thing about the reward is enough paper is that it claims that the RL framework, and not just model free or model based, is sufficient to capture like all behaviors and solve everything. And so the problem with that paper is that it overlooks a lot of things, including the notion of representations. And that was some of the things that was mentioned, that even in the RL framework, you have these other notions of representations that are not just about rewards, for instance. And those are some of the critiques that like Vlad, me, and other people at like DeepMind provided for it. I think we put too many things at the same time in the discussion that might go in different directions. But I think something that I'm beginning to realize is one potential benefit of confounding and confusing the term model-based using the literature from cognitive and psychological sciences is to reclaim that notion of the broader notion of models of the world. So it's a bit almost like a rebellion against the computer scientists. In that intentionally disruptive way, I would be totally on board with saying we're going to reclaim this word and we're going to use it differently. What I don't agree with is confusing instead of actually understanding first and then reclaiming or subverting or going against, which I'm very for. I think clarity first is what I'm trying to argue for here. Clarity first, subversion second, because like otherwise it might sound like we are disagreeing with something, but really if you look in the details and like read the subtitles, you see, oh, actually they're saying the same thing. It's just like they're not translating it with the same math. Yeah, but I agree with Anne, though. The term model in cognitive science and psychology is used all over the place for many different things. In fact, even a model free is called a model free model. So it's like, you know, a model, some people call it like model free agent. Oh, I'm doing some modeling. What kind of modeling are you doing? I'm building model free models. You know, like the term modeling as a verb also is used.
I think I'm about to shoot myself.
Yes, that's why I'm saying let's find new words or subvert them intentionally, because there's already too much of this word being used. So when it comes as a verb, then it's applied to basically any kind of model you make of any neuron or any behavior in cognitive science and neuroscience. But then in cognitive science and psychology, the kind of psychological models or cognitive models are a little different. They could be box and arrow models that somebody wrote in the 60s. And somehow, surprisingly, they still work to explain behavior. And we build computational models, but somehow the same intuitions still hold. So model is not always a computational model. It's not always not a computational model. it's not always model based, it's not always model free, it's not always even RL. There's Bayesian models, there's so many other models. It's a confusing field, I guess, in terms of the terms.
But I understood Imran's question as being like, what do we mean by internal models, not computational models, which seems to be what you're defining here. And internal models, like what Imran was saying, is like, sounds like any kind of representation, the way I said it. And, you know, like in a sense, you're right. And I'm not sure how I could restrict it more. I'm sure it's broader than just a transition and a reward function. And I'm sure you're right that it's also less broad than what I said, like an internal representation, but it's certainly somewhere in between. You know, that's not like something so it's, you know, some kind of compression or, you know, of the environment of the problem we're trying to do decision making in, and that's being used for the algorithm. But I'm not sure exactly what. Ida, it's super loud. Sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Forgot to.
I don't know if it's just me, but I
mean, it seems to me like this question, what is the nature of the internal models that we use, is the key question, unanswered question of psychology and neuroscience. So I don't think it's been answered.
I agree. I don't think it's been answered. And Imran, some of us believe that it has something to do with the relational structures, either outside or inside. And I think that idea, like, if you look at Paul Chizek's even this kind of evolutionary ideas, it's like, you know, there was a point where it was just like tiny sort of organisms just moving towards the direction of the food. Then gradually they develop eyes, then gradually they develop flippers so that they can move in different directions. They can have more sensory input. Then at some point, there are so many things with which the agent is, or the organism is interacting with the environment, that it needs an internal kind of system that just manages those. And that point happened way before humans or mammals or anything in evolution, that at some point there was just some things inside the body needed to just control and manage the body together, because there was just too many moving parts at that point. And then some people think it's then that these kinds of things start, when you have computations inside an organism that's just trying to control. Some people say, no, it's even since the cells, that's the case. Some people come further down and say, no, it's only when you start to have an explicit model of your periphery or something in something that is brain-like. So there's disagreements of when that idea of internal model can be really applied. I'm on the side that says it should be more complex. Like, it's, for me, it has to do with more advanced species. I wouldn't say that there is an internal model for, you know, amoeba or something that is very small. But in that way, I think that what you're saying is important, to know the relational structures, whether it's between something in the inside and outside, or whether it's between things on the outside to each other, or it's between things on the inside to each other. So a representation that's just noise and doesn't distinguish between different things, or it's like, you know, spontaneous representations, are they model of the world? Are they not? They might be, but we need to first identify what are the relational structures. And I think this is what Anne was saying earlier. This is why what Anne was saying earlier is important, that what we call model-based could actually have episodic memory, which has these associative structures. It could have working memory, where it has like most recent kind of things that I have tried to maintain a high fidelity version of. And, you know, not even online the whole time, it could be on and off. There's just different versions of it. But I think for me, what matters is that relational structure, whether it's on the outside, it's about entities on the outside having a relational structure, or entities inside. So like my representation of, let's say, my address of my parents' home versus my sister's home, and the relationship of that thing together. Whatever it is, I think it needs to be relational, and it needs to capture some structure that's meaningful.
Should we let Jason ask his question?
Thanks.
Thanks.
Hi, Anne. Thanks for the great presentation. I really enjoyed it. I just wanted to ask what you exactly meant by like working memory, because I wasn't entirely sure if you meant more of like a Hopfield network style associative memory, or some like entangled memory, like for example, RNN and hidden state that carries information from the past that's relevant, but it's not necessarily like directly decodable like easily?
Can I ask, you have an AI background or a psychology background?
I have AI background.
That's what it sounded like. Thank you for the question. So I don't mean either. I don't want to like commit to either of those two. I'm taking really the working memory definition from the psychology literature here, which is any information that you are able to explicitly hold in mind for a short amount of time, that is very limited, and that can be information that's accessible outside, or that you have created internally and that you can also manipulate online. So people tend to give the example of like phone numbers, like remembering a phone number, like by super actively maintaining it until you finally typed it and then you immediately discard it. This type of phenomenon. So that phenomenon as a whole is very broadly studied in psychology and well defined. And then there's a bunch of people who have said like, well, maybe I can model it with helpful networks or with RNNs or whatnot. And those types of models have more or less success at capturing various aspects of working memory. And so they are, like they capture some, for example, LSTMs or things like that. Like they capture some notion of working memory in the sense that the information is encoded in activity rather than in weights, which is also somewhat debated in the brain, but like at least until recently, people agreed working memory was held more in active spiking rather than in synapses, synaptic weights. Now there's a bit more debate around that. So in that sense, it's similar, but in some senses, it's also very different because working memory, like is easily internally manipulatable, and is also fundamentally limited. It's like something that we really can't hold much of, like, as if you've tried to hold phone numbers in mind, really. And that's not a feature of RNNs or LSTMs. There's a limit, but you can always add more. And so in that sense, it's not a crucial feature of RNNs. It's a bug for RNNs, really, in many ways. So I don't think there exists a good equivalent of working memory in the AI literature currently, and it's actually something I've made a case for. I think artificial agents should consider thinking about working memory and should consider thinking about the feature that working memory is limited as a feature, not as a bug, to try to see if that might help in flexible, dynamic decision making. But I don't think there is a good equivalent. Helpful networks, RNNs capture some aspects of them quite well, but not the holistic concept, I think.
Right. Could you just repeat what about like associative memories like Copfield network doesn't capture your notion of working memory again?
It's so helpful networks. Well, I'm not an expert, so sorry if I say silly things, but I think it does have this. I think you'll get it to encode information that you input, but you won't get it to encode information that it generates itself. But I could be wrong there. Is that right?
It generates itself as in, like, for example, sampling from like a generative model like this.
Well, so just take so if you think about the experiment I gave you, right? I presented my talk, like you'll do something like see the pumpkin, press the first key and get no reward, and then see the pumpkin again, press the second key and get no reward. Any human is going to say, okay, so then the third key was correct, and instead of loading two slots to remember action 1 and action 2 are incorrect, I'm just going to remember that action 3 is correct for the pumpkin, right? So even if you've never seen this information ever, working memory, you're going to be able to do this mental manipulation and only hold information like, let's press the third key for the pumpkin.
Okay. To me, that's more of like the job of a controller that's manipulating the memory, but maybe.
Yeah, but we do think there's a bunch of evidence in psychology that this is the kind of you know, you use working memory as a kind of blackboard, essentially, like to manipulate information live. And so this, you know, I think people use helpful networks as a way to model short-term visual memory, for example, where there isn't this manipulation component. And that works fairly well, I think. Again, not my expertise. So if anyone else.
So is what are you including in the notion of working memory the manipulations we can do, like counting, for example?
Yeah.
Is that something working memory does, or is that some extra thing that operates on what's in working memory? I think that's sort of what you're asking.
Yeah.
I see. No, I think it's something extra, but that is dependent on working memory. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure. Not sure. I don't think the field is sure either.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Our next highly voted question is Alexandria. I invited them to join us, but I don't see them for some reason. Let me just try that again. Sometimes this thing is very slow. I'm just going to try again, or I'm just going to read it if that helps. Invite user, yes. Let's see. Okay, let's see if they're going to join us. I don't see them joining, so I don't know if... Okay, so let me just maybe read the question. So the next question is for John, actually, turns out. It says, John, is there a theoretically based reason RL would be isolated from planning? I'm curious about your thought process.
I think, you know, when a Sutton and Bartow treatment would say that you absolutely can plan on a model in the RL sense. And, you know, there's a kind of symmetry between learning out in the world and then operating on a representation in the RL framework. So, you know, planning is used 1,000 times. That word comes up in the Sutton and Bartow book, planning, right? So I don't believe that kind of planning happens in animals, okay? I think that you're much more likely to find what Ida's done and what Anne was talking about, these smart model-free-ish algorithms that look like you're running a kind of Tolman map or a model, but I don't think it is happening. You know, that's why there's such a debate. You know, you have all these papers about whether you really are seeing that kind of planning. I'm not convinced by it. Do I believe that planning happens on models of the world, at least in humans? Absolutely, of course they do, right? I mean, I imagine the New York subway in my head, and I plan my trip with the subway in my head, right? I can think in my head when I pass a nice furniture store and I go, ooh, would that couch fit in my living room, right? And it's about this size, you know, could I get it through the door? You know, I'm planning whether that couch will fit in my house, right? What I'm saying is that they are just, one doesn't happen outside of computers, and the other one isn't going to be explained by the kind of planning that works in computers. So they're basically, in my view, two completely different universes and two very different notions of planning that have unfortunately got conflated. Okay, so I'm just saying,
John, are you saying that you're planning but not computing values forward?
Yes, I just don't think that. Well, just to be clear, I think that, you know, the interesting notion of planning with a model is some kind of simulation. I mean, you know, Ida used the word like a rollout, right? You roll out alternatives, each one has a value, and then you pick the rollout with the best value, and then you do it. So planning is entertaining and rolling out alternatives and picking one, right? I don't think that ever happens in animals. Okay, and that's a debate for another time. I think what you find instead is things, as you both have said, that look like that, but are not actually true overt. Ooh, I did this road and I did that one, and I look at them in my head, and then and that's why, you know, that latest paper in November 2021 by Laura and Frank, looking at replay, said that in fact that wasn't planning, right? Kind of interesting, right? So, but we plan. I mean, I plan to be on the Learning Salon, right? Got to get to my room. So it's another word that maybe we'll have to subject to the IDA treatment, which is we have to be careful about when we use the word planning in the Sutton and Bartow sense and the simulation rollout sense versus planning, which I think we all do, at least as humans, which I don't think fits into that framework. And then there's a huge gap in between that to me will just be clever model-free algorithms doing most of the work. So computers do rollout, animals do clever things like Ida showed in successor representation, and we do true planning on models of our apartment in our head, and they bear no relationship to the algorithms that are being used otherwise.
I mean, I can plan one step at a time, even though but I have to choose to do it. It's not how I think normally brains do. I do think animals have planning. On that, I think I disagree with you. And I don't think it's all a trick. I think there's just like some smart things animal brains can do, actually. I think yeah.
I think it's an implicit trick. No, I think it's an implicit trick. I think if you're going to use planning, and I think you used the word at some point, Anne, of explicit. In other words, I really don't think
a dangerous word to use.
Yeah, it is a dangerous word to use. But what I'm just saying is, I'm just laying down where I stand. Is I think that it's a little bit like the dog that didn't bark in Sherlock Holmes. It is extremely difficult to find really definitive evidence of planning that isn't subjectable to model-free mimics because they lie at the edge. In humans, there's no such tension. It's unequivocal. And I just find it really interesting that in everything but humans, there are alternative explanations. And I wonder why that is. And I think that that's because we don't have an explanation yet, the kind of way that we do it. And I actually use the term, we simulate simulation as humans. We pretend to do it. Like Ida kind of said, you can kind of overtly pretend to do it, right? But I just don't think it happens in animals. And that's why I think the computer science notion is actually misleading us.
So you said a lot of things, some of which I disagreed with, but I'm just going to go and ask the next question, because this is something we have discussed about like for 2 years, and we're going to be discussing for the next 10 years. That's okay. Hopefully we will at some point come to a kind of understanding in spite of agreement. And I think we are there, close to there, but I appreciate that you shared it, John. I think there's some interesting things that can come out of these discussions. I want to read the next question. They ask, working memory and RL engage different parts of the frontal cortex. I'm not sure if I agree with that, but they mean dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and medial PFC. Is this what allows for these processes to occur in parallel, or is it more that they occur as distinct processes that influence one another? Something I just want to say to this person, I think they might not be online if they watch later, is that actually there's not a clear-cut distinction between, for instance, small-based, small-free and other things in the brain in the way that they were hoping, and that's part of the reason other things came out. But DLPFC does appear, and MPFC, in both of those processes. I don't know of a distinction, but Anne, maybe you want to say something about this.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. It's not at all as clear-cut as that. That said, I think so. I guess I tried to be careful about, like saying separate process, but not independent in my talk. And I think my best definition of that is that, you could somehow lesion one and have the other still do the job, and vice versa. Obviously, you can't do that in humans, but that's where non-human animal work helps. And I think that's something that's somewhat fair to say for working memory and RL, in the sense that I think they are separable networks in the brain. I don't know if that's what allows them to run in parallel, because I think they still interact a bunch. So, like we know that working memory is also dependent on those cortical, subcortical loops, for example, at least to a degree. And I do think that RL, networks can originate also in lateral PFC. So there's no clear-cut dissociation there. So I actually don't think we understand well at this point at all at the neural level how it is that they operate in parallel without interfering too much. They do interfere to a degree, but not catastrophically for sure. So I don't think that's well understood. But if someone has a better answer, I'd love to hear it.
Thank you so much. The next question is from Sukyan, and they say, given the neural mechanisms, there is an arrow towards computation hypothesis. We seem to need, need to have a solid grasp of the neural correlates. However, it seems human learning have a shared structure underlying different neural correlates. Take, for instance, a person trying to solve Rubik's Cube, a person trying to run out of a maze of a Carley's graph. Computationally, they could be solved by the same algorithm, but when one looks at the neural correlates, they seem completely irrelevant.
Yeah, so I think this person is referring to my suggestion that rather than going from computation to cognition, we try to go the other way, and making the point that this is making the rather optimistic assumption that we actually have a good grasp on on the brain and psychology, and I agree with them that our grasp of what does what in the brain, or how the brain does various things is weak, and so that's a limitation of this approach for sure. I do think so. I do think we have. We still have untapped knowledge, and I do think that's dependent not just on the brain but also on psychology that has isolated very useful concepts, I think. But yes, I think it's certainly a limitation of this approach. My point is that, especially in the field of reinforcement learning, so far I think the balance has been in the opposite direction, and I think we should reconsider this direction, and probably in the long run have a good balance between the two. And also, I think that's also an argument for doing multi-species research. So to foreseeing what can be generalized from. Sorry, Ida, that's super loud. Yeah, thank you for trying to see what it is that we can import from non-human animal studies, and what knowledge that brings us about the brain that can be generalized to better understanding the computations happening in different networks.
Thank you. Oh, that's loud. I think we have the opposite kind of headphones. Like mine is like right next to my fan, and it's amplifying the sound of my fan. And I'm so sorry. Every time that I accidentally hit this button, you're hearing the sound. I'm sorry. I try to fix it next time. The last thing that I wanted to, okay, so Tsukian says, great, thank you. I think the last thing that I just wanted to ask is what do you think are is there another question that I missed? I think I managed all of it. What do you think is the next direction that you think would be important in the research at the intersection of RL and human research? Because that's something that you have done for a long time. How do you see the field growing in the next 10 years, especially given that radical advances in deep reinforcement learning approaches?
I think, I mean, there's a bunch of directions. I think, yeah, there's a bunch of directions. One is, I think, encouraging AI people to take a bit more inspiration from cognitive neuroscience research, and I'd love to see more working memory in RL agents. One is thinking about hierarchy and structure in general, and how that supports generalization and transfer, because I think that's something that's essential in humans, and there's some evidence that there's lots of evidence, I guess, that humans do that, and that supports generalization. And I don't think that's I don't think the computations behind that are well understood. I think the high level idea that this is important is very well accepted, but how that happens is much less well understood, I think. Something I've been really interested in lately is to also try to understand essentially, going back to model-free era, I think we have model-free computations in the brain, and I think they take three types of inputs: the states, the actions, and the rewards to run. And I think those models often take those three for granted, like what the state is would be a stimulus, and what the action is would be like a key press or something like that in humans, and what the reward is just like the +1 or 0 you get at the outcome. And I actually think, assuming that the brain does RL computation in those networks, I don't think those are the states and actions and rewards it takes as inputs are actually trivial in any way. And in particular, what counts as a reward as far as the brain is concerned, I think is very non-trivial and a very important question to ask. So that's something that I've been working on, and I think is going to be fairly important in the next few years, I think.
Can I ask, as a corollary, from what you just said, it seems to me that an enormous amount of intelligent behavior of agents, biological or machine, can really be explained by a family of algorithms that are model-free plus, as you are beginning to say, right?
Yeah.
So it just seems to me that the really interesting biological work is that you see all this goal-directed behavior, from bacteria to lizards to mice to primates, and so much of it could be lots of a family of smart model-free algorithms in the broader sense. That seems to be a really interesting scientific neuroscience psychological project, which is what you're suggesting. But do you think that the model-based RL, just very clear, I'm gonna be IDA from now on. Okay, I'm gonna use that longer. Do you think, you seem to suggest at the beginning of your talk that seemed to be a little less biological or something like that? So do you think that it's really, if you want to do computer-based AI, by all means, talk about model-based RL and whatever that is. If you want to do science and understand animal intelligence, it seems to be a lot of these model-free-ish algorithms. And that's the state of the game, and that really biologically, psychologically, neuroscientific model-based RL is maybe less helpful, as I've intimated. Is that, and we should be going after sort of all the hierarchical RLs and successor representations and things for biology?
Yeah, so, what do you call that? It's a stretch goal, I think, because, even last month, I think I've seen a paper in one of the Nature blah, 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 start with the abstract being, there are two types of learning in humans. One is model-based equals goal-directed, and one is model-free equals habits. So if already I could not have this kind of abstracts 5 years from now, I would be happy.
Yeah.
And then the stretch goal is to like, I don't want to attack model-based RL as a model of cognition, but I do think that so far it's still not clear at all to me that it is a unit that is valid for human learning and decision making. I think it's caught a lot of things so far, but I don't know that it is capturing something meaningful really.
Yeah.
I very much agree. What we call reward in RL might actually be a combination of very complex things that we are just really massively simplifying in ways that is hurting us. Those of us who are interested in animal and human behavior, I think people sometimes unfortunately confuse engineering success with scientific accuracy. And we had a lot of discussions about this last time too. And I think what today made me realize is there might be room for really clarifying these things, and if needed, after clarification, reclaiming certain things. For those of us who actually do care about human behavior or brains or animal brains and behavior, and not just engineering success. I think we addressed everything. I just want to thank you, but also open again the floor for Melanie or John, and just say what a pleasure it is to have you here and to hear. I really appreciate Melanie's clarification points, and I kept thinking about them throughout the whole session. And I think it's very important. Maybe it is important to, at this point, look back at the history of RL and its behaviorist legacy in terms of the challenges we are facing now. Because even if we add models and talk about intrinsic motivation and abstractions and HRL, we're still really in that framework, in that kind of, and I would love it if, Melanie, you have something to add to that. Like, how do you think, even in model-based RL and even in intrinsic motivation, we still have the legacy of behaviorism? I think that's a very deep question you asked earlier.
Yeah, I mean, well, I don't think I understand model-based RL in the technical sense of it well enough to say. It seems like a very impoverished view of what a model is. And, one of the things that always bothered me about RL in general is the notion of state, a fundamental notion in RL, and yet recognizing that you are in a particular state, which is kind of given in most RL algorithms, is, I think, the hardest part. And that's why, when John says, well, bacteria, whatever, all these animals, we can explain their behavior by model-free RL, we still have that problem of how an organism recognizes it's in a particular kind of state when there's, that's not an easy problem. Anyway, that's kind of my last comment here.
My comment would be, honestly, some of the shows recently are not getting onto YouTube. I'm not quite sure why, but I will say, I really hope this one gets on soon, because Anne, I mean this sincerely, I don't quite realize the service you've done. I really mean that. I think anyone who is a little bit in love with reinforcement learning computationally will benefit from this discussion in terms of what it does and does not cover. And it will be food for thought. And I'm sure there'll be more comments. And I almost feel like at some point there should be a follow-up. But this is really the discussion about reinforcement learning I wanted. So I'm selfish. And I think it's just really kudos to you. And also it's kind of a little bit of a treat to, I'm sure for me and for Melanie, to have two experts on RL discussing it. I mean, it's just, in a way that isn't at all, dogmatic, right? It's about really trying to explore the boundaries and I think any student should listen to this. I'm just saying thank you in my usual long-winded way. So I really enjoyed it a great deal. Thank you, Anne.
I feel like we need Anne another time.
Thank you so much.
I think, Anne, this was such a great talk, and I kind of wish, honestly, we have you at another point, maybe like months later, a year later, for like a second part on your hierarchical oral work and your other work.
I'll be happy. This was great. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us in spite of your babysitter thing. I was hoping to see your kids in the view, but unfortunately they weren't there.
Yeah, I mean, anyway, it would be very complicated if you saw her. So.
Best of luck with family and the move. And,
yes.
and
thank you so much.
And everyone, please
thank you.
join us next week for a guest that Melanie actually invited, and we're very excited about it. It's David Chalmers, and there's going to be conversation about consciousness. Melanie, if you want to say something before,
is it consciousness or is it his new book?
It's about, I think he's going to talk about language models and understanding and consciousness.
So it's not his new book on VR.
Well, you can ask him about it.
No, it's great. I'd much more, I'd love to hear about understanding, obviously, Melanie, I'm sure you shepherded him into that. That'll be fantastic.
Well, he's been going around giving talks about that anyway. So
yeah.
Be interesting. Yeah.
Ciao.
Okay. Bye-bye.